Good morning, welcome everybody. Thanks to be here so early and waking up early to listen to our panel, Word on Censorship panel. As you guess, is something about censorship, of course, something with journalists we deal, we can say, daily somehow, and not only journalists, also citizens of the world. Well, why we choose this topic? Here we have Index on Censorship editor and a lot of people, they are contributors of Index on Censorship magazine, plus Marta Ottaviani, she's really a journalist very committed in the issue of censorship in Turkey. So all these people here, I think they know what we are talking about. And why choosing this topic? Because we can say the new winds of censorship are blowing not only from the Middle East and Africa, but also from the Americas and Europe. And that's what we want to talk about today. So I briefly introduce our speakers one by one. Rachel Jolie, as I said before, is the editor of Index on Censorship magazine, and she has 20 years of experience in these fields. Ismail Aina, she is a freelance journalist based in London and usually covers migration issues. I was in Italy in the south and he reports about mafia in the south, and is also a fellow of Dar Center. And Duncan Tucker is a British freelance based in Mexico. So he currently used to deal with what's moving there, human rights issues, migration, drugs, Mexican politics. And Marta Ottaviani, as I said before, she's a correspondent from Turkey. She lived there for 8 years. And I can say is the Italian journalist who knows, I think, better than others, the country. And just 2 words about me, I'm also contributing to Index on Censorship, and I used to cover issues from the Gulf, especially from Yemen and Iraq, where the 2 countries I cover mostly. So, Rachel, just want to start with you, of course, and can you give to the audience an insight about the activities that Index does since years, and what's the mood of censorship in the world right now, and especially focusing on Americas and Europe, because something's changing. We feel that in the global trend, something's changing and is emerging, this change.
Yes, so hello, as Laura said, my name's Rachel Jolie. I'm the editor of Index on Censorship magazine, which looks like this. We're a quarterly magazine that covers the world and is read around the world on issues of freedom of expression and censorship. We have reporters around the world, so it's a mixture of journalism and fiction of novelists, playwrights who are censored in their own country. And we also have a project called Mapping Media Freedom, which this is the latest report, which covers 42 countries around Europe. So we're looking at attacks on the media in all those countries. And anyone can register an attack, so it's crowdsourced. And then the report is fact-checked by our team before it's published and mapped. And we have obviously seen an increase in attacks on journalists, which include physical threats, threats about losing their jobs, and people losing their jobs and being imprisoned, particularly, as you'll all be aware, I hope, from Turkey this year. There's been a massive increase. But we're also very worried about what's been happening in Hungary and Poland, where, where the government has been using its powers to restrict journalist access. So in Poland, in December, the government tried to restrict the number of journalists, for instance, going in to cover Parliament. We've also seen measures of the government favouring the pro-government media, and how the pressures on the independent media increasing, which is a parallel story in Hungary. But I think it's important to remember that there is issues, different types of censorship operating in every country, and not to ignore the issues that are going on in your own country. So issues like massive defamation actions in Italy, for instance, where Italian journalists are threatened with massive fines and prison sentences potentially for covering controversial stories. So, yeah, so I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Rachel. And I think we will be back to some focus on Europe and on Italy because we are here, so we can talk about it. And Ismail, you currently report about refugee crisis. You were in Sicily. You are originally from Corn of Africa for family reasons. So this is an area with a massive problem about censorship, governments, dictatorships, and plus urgent social issues like terrorism or, for example, malnutrition or anything related to human rights issues. So what's your experience in these fields?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I report for Index on Censorship, like a few people on the table, covering East Africa largely, looking at issues of censorship, threats to journalists. And I've reported on two of the countries which are perhaps the most censored. In fact, they're in the top 10 most censored countries in the world, and that is Eritrea and Ethiopia. And Eritrea often makes the top of the bottom of the list as the country with the least free press. So I've been covering issues around threats to journalists, so that's physical threats, intimidations, police, usage of laws, particularly terrorism laws you've seen. And I'm just noticing that Rachel has a copy. If you don't mind, I grab. So this was an issue that Index did, Danger in Truth, Truth in Danger, special report, journalist under fire and under pressure. And I did a report for this issue, which was looking at threats to journalists in Kenya, and I reported about a Kenyan journalist called Yasin Juma, who reports on Al-Shabaab, the terror group in Somalia, and was looking at the war that Kenya and the Kenyan security forces are engaged in southern Somalia. And he was doing his job, getting the story, which contradicted what the government had said. It was to do with the number of Kenyan troops that were murdered. And because he did the good journalism, local journalism, getting the story, getting the facts, getting the numbers, getting out there, the Kenyan authorities did not like that. So, and because he shared information via WhatsApp and social media, they charged him for the misuse of telecommunication gadgets and tried to charge him under terror law. So, what you see across the region that I know, East Africa, from Kenya to Eritrea to Somalia to Ethiopia and elsewhere, is you're seeing increased threats against journalists who are covering important subjects. And it's not just the state, it's also businesses. And I guess you're saying, Laura, about the wider context in the Horn of Africa right now. In East Africa, you have probably the most devastating famine anywhere, probably since 1945. About 16 million people at risk. You have the Islamist violence in Somalia. So last year, 3 Somali journalists were murdered in the south, mostly in Mogadishu, by probably people linked to Al-Shabaab. So again, the instability and the violence is creating this perfect storm where journalists are facing threats from the state, from governments, from security services, from businesses, and also facing threats from terror organizations.
Thanks, Ismail. I also can say that personally I witnessed something regarding journalists. Ethiopian journalist was working for me when I was editor-in-chief of a little Italian magazine about African issues, and the guy struggled a lot to go out from Ethiopia, and he received a lot of threats, and he needed help from CPJ and other international organizations. Now, luckily, he's in US as a refugee, but it was really a very long process, very difficult process, and he went into really a bad situation for him, for his family, for his wife. So we have these cases, and unfortunately, we see all this, and this area is really it's really difficult for journalists to try to be independent voices. But as I said before, is an area also from this area, people also try to go out, just citizens, I mean, not only journalists or thinkers. So we see a lot of Eritrean, for example, in Italy, and Italy is one of the places where Eritrean they are coming, and unfortunately for the relations between Italy and Eritrea, all these people, they don't receive any help. So it's really heartbreaking sometimes to see all this. And about refugee issues related also to the environment, Duncan, you live in Mexico, so you see from inside the impact that society is so, I can say, but you can say also not, but I guess so corrupted like the Mexican society has on its citizens and more on journalists. Can you please tell us something about it?
Yeah, so Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries in the world to be a journalist today. There were at least 9 journalists murdered last year. There were 3 journalists murdered just last month. And over 100 journalists have been killed in Mexico since the year 2000. There was a sharp increase in the level of attacks on the press since the beginning of the drug war in 2006. Since then, across the country, over 200,000 people have been killed. At least 27,000 people have disappeared. So there's a real need for a press that can hold these abuses to account. The attacks on journalists, it's not part of a coordinated campaign against the press. It's more the consequence of rampant and out of control impunity. 99% of attacks against the press go unsolved and unpunished. I think it's important to make a distinction between what it's like to be a foreign journalist in Mexico and Mexican journalists. It's quite rare for foreign journalists like myself to come under attack, whereas I think there's there'd be more international pressure if foreign journalists were targeted, whereas Mexican journalists operate with basically no protection whatsoever. Particularly in rural areas, people who work for local newspapers, it's become common for drug cartels to infiltrate newsrooms and offer journalists what they call plomo or plata, which is silver or lead. It's a bribe or a bullet in the head. So the journalists don't have much choice in many cases. If they turn down the money, all of their families could be killed. And this creates a lack of trust and unity within newsrooms, a lack of solidarity. It's also, I think, important to mention there's a kind of misconception in Mexico that the drug cartels are responsible for all of the violence against journalists. An investigation by Article 19 revealed that about half, maybe more than half of attacks against the press are actually carried out by corrupt officials rather than the cartels. And there's also a big issue about the financial control over the media. Historically, the Mexican government has favored a kind of policy of soft coercion where it controls the media economically. The current Enrique Peña Nieto, the president, his administration has spent more on publicity and advertising than any previous administration. And what this does is create economic dependency. All of the newspapers rely on government money to survive, which completely undermines their ability to criticize the government because they could just take away that money. There's also been a recent increase in surveillance of journalists with phone tapping, hacking into private communications. We know the government's been buying highly sophisticated spyware to keep tabs on journalists as well as activists and the political opposition. And in recent years, we've also begun to see Mexican politicians suing journalists. Some of Mexico's most prominent journalists have now faced lawsuits for reporting on allegations against high-profile politicians. And given the level of corruption in Mexico and the deeply flawed justice system, there's no guarantee that the courts will give these journalists a fair trial. And another recent development has been the use of bots and trolls to threaten and slander journalists on social media, as well as activists. They're used to intimidate and discredit them And this can spill over into threats in real life, where they begin publishing journalists' addresses online and inviting attacks against them. But I think there is some cause for optimism. The growth of the internet and social media, access to smartphones, has also given people the ability to live stream demonstrations or events or even shootouts, things that would have gone unreported in the past. The Mexican government can't control access to information in the same way that it could throughout much of the 20th century. It still has a lot of influence over Mexico's two biggest TV networks and traditional media like the newspapers and the radio. But there's been a lot of growth of good independent news sites that provide more critical and in-depth coverage of events online. But I think there needs to be a bit more unity between not just journalists, but newspaper owners, business owners, sponsors, and advertisers. And the government needs to create a genuinely autonomous, independent body to investigate and punish crimes against the press.
Thanks very much, Duncan. You mentioned, I think, really very well the role of social media and the ties between social media, censorship, government. It's really a very, very hard topic. And you, Marta, you were based in Turkey for 8 years, and now you go back and often. You are a witness of, you can say, an expected, but for others, unexpected process of progressive and more intense censorship. It's a censorship very, very well focused also on the users in social media, on people who tweet, and also happen to you sometimes to be blocked on Twitter and social media. So can you tell us all the passages of the Turkish government around those measures, or if you want just to start and then we go ahead in this long story?
Okay. Thank you, Laura. Thanks to the audience for attending this panel. I will try actually to explain briefly how we get to this point. At the beginning of his ruling, Recep Tayyip Erdogan played the role of a reformist leader, promising the entry of Turkey in the European Union and the full democratization of the country. On the other hand, there was a former establishment, we can call it in this way, made of all the political parties under the influence of the military. And this old establishment was rightly, of course, perceived by the people like somebody oppressing the individual and fundamental rights, as well as press freedom. But the point is that the plan of Recep Tayyip Erdogan was totally different from the one he got the power in 2002. And between 2007 and 2011, first he worked to erase the power of the secular part of the military and the judiciary establishment. And then after that, they started to do exactly the same of them, starting to oppress fundamental rights, making less important the entry in the European Union in this political program, and then starting to treat and put pressure on the publishers and journalists. There are two phases, basically, two steps in this process. First, Erdogan started with put under pressure publishers, treating them. For example, there is a very famous case of Doğan Holding, who received a fine of more than $2 billion in 2008, and it was a threat because they were publishing materials and articles that Erdogan didn't like. So it was like, how can I say, a threat and also an example for all the other publishers, because Doğan that time and still now is the most important publisher in the country. So the message of Erdogan is, if I can eat Doğan Holding, I can put in troubles every one of you. So this was the first step. The second step was, the consequence of this first step was that Turkish journalists started to implement self-censorship in their articles, and it was something who could be really noticed reading Turkish newspaper. The editorial line of some newspaper changed totally in a few months, so it was something very impressive. Then, in a second step, when Erdogan consolidated power in his hands, he started to shut down directly opposition newspaper and opposition media with the accusation that they were a part of a terrorist organization. There are two kinds of enemies for Erdogan now in the country. First is the PKK and the Kurdish minority, and the second one, and he almost makes no distinction between Kurdish people and PKK. Also, it serves to him in order to put under troubles more people as he can. And the second organization is FETÖ, which is the organization linked to Fethullah Gülen, a former imam who lives in the United States, and it is considered the mastermind of Turkish political stage since the 80s, and also it was the owner of several media shut down after 2011, and is considered the responsible of the last, let's call it failed coup of last July. There is only one point nobody remembers. Till 2010, Fethullah Gülen was the most powerful ally of Erdogan. And till Fethullah Gülen was useful to erase the power of the judiciary and the military establishment, of course, Erdogan made an alliance with him, even if they become from two different wings of the right side in Turkish policy. But after that, he became his first enemy, and now in Turkey there are 139 journalists convicted, and on 149, 144 are convicted because they are terrorists. I mean, they are charged with terrorist accusations, not with crime related to the press. It is something very impressive, for me, really appalling. And there are only 4 impartial newspapers left with a very small audience, 4 with less than 50,000 copies sold on a population of more 80 million of people, so really a really few audience, and there are 15,000 people, if I remember well, 15,000 Twitter account under judicial inquiry because of their tweets. So it is really. These are really worrisome figures, and that's why I really think that now Turkey is already beyond the censorship.
Thank you, Martha. So as we heard from Duncan and Martha, from Turkey to Mexico, we see increased censorship, we're seeing the threats that are happening to journalists, whether, as you say, Marta, in Turkey, it's the usage of terrorism laws. That's the case in East Africa, where we see the state use these charges of terror as a means to stifle and control the free press. And we heard from Rachel, it's not just in the Middle East or the Americas, it's also in Europe, right here in Italy too, issues with defamation laws. I just wanted to come to Laura, because Laura has done some fantastic journalism reporting from Mosul, but particularly the country she's reported from for the last few years is Yemen. And Yemen, as we all know, is going through a devastating civil war. So I just wanted to ask Laura if you could just tell us a little bit about what is it like to be a reporter, journalist, both as a foreign correspondent, but also just as a journalist on the ground in Yemen currently.
Thanks for your question, Ismail. We can say that being journalist in Yemen, as Duncan said before, as a foreigner is completely different than being a Yemeni. And just because you don't participate to tribal system, which sometimes helps you to go ahead, sometimes defends you, but also sometimes can put you in a very bad position. For example, if on the ground you have 2 or more factions of people, they are battling and they are killing themselves. And so being foreign journalist in Yemen, I can say, in somehow, if you know the culture and you know what to go in, it's better than being a Yemeni. But I just wish to tell you a little bit what is happening to Yemen to Yemeni journalists, because we don't tell stories from Yemen because we, as foreign journalists, we can't go in because the country is completely isolated, and our sources are only local journalists. And in 2 years, the 2 years of war have changed the Yemeni media landscape to the worst. In terms of number of publications, independence, freedom of media, of the press, and distribution also. Recently combined a kind of report for European Journalist Center, so I think will be released, and every one of us who are involved in the project, we are talking about one country, you know, more. And actually, you can say from the perspective of Freedom House in 2016, the rates of the country, considering, you know, freedom, went to a score that is 83 to 100. 100 means the worst situation. So, and how this situation is applied and what are the consequences on journalists. Consequences are being killed, of course, in the battlefield, and what's currently happened in Tides. There's also a very famous video with a photographer who is killed on, it's not exactly a front line, but just he was passed by and he was shot. And just because media are very polarized. So, Al Jazeera covers the issue from the side of government and the side of Saudis, we can say that, and other governmental media, they continue to cover from this side. But there's also an emerging media from the Houthi side and covers all the north. So journalists are exactly like soldiers. If you have somebody with a camera, they shoot him and they kill him. But it's only one of the possibilities, because the thing that happens often is being kidnapped. Being kidnapped happened for everybody, for all Yemeni journalists. In Taiz, 2 or 3 colleagues were kidnapped recently, and they were from Al Jazeera, but we can say the same and more in the area of Sana'a. We still have people in jail, and we don't know exactly why they stay there, and the family are, they receive threats. And a lot of media were emerging after the uprising. Actually, it's not possible to reach their websites. There are not, free media like the media start to being founded by CPJ or other international organizations after the uprising, because they are considered enemy, for example, for the new government of the north. And so actually can say that really for Yemeni journalists is a nightmare. A lot of people, they try to go out of the country, they try to report from outside, but of course it's not the same to be on the ground.
Okay. Right. Okay. I think we're going to have a general conversation now. So I guess I want to go back to Duncan, because Duncan was talking about Mexico, and I haven't been to Mexico, but I find it really fascinating that most of us assume it's the narcos, it's the drug cartels that are involved in threats to journalists. But what you're saying is, according to research, I think done by Article 19, that at least half, if not more, of threats to journalists in Mexico are actually from politicians. So if you could just say a little bit more about that, it'd be really fascinating.
Sure. Well, it's not always, for example, the central federal government that's behind these threats or attacks. In many cases, it's mayors or governors or kind of lower down politicians in towns and across the country. It's also sometimes hard to draw a fine line between the cartels and organised crime and the government, because in many cases, especially in local areas, the government's completely infiltrated by organised crime. their campaign funds come through money laundering, and just last week, the Attorney General in one state who's in charge of security and the justice system was arrested in the United States for drug trafficking. So you can't always say that this person's government or this person's from a cartel, because in many cases it can be one and the same thing. Yeah.
Okay. And then maybe, I don't know, I'll pass it back to you, Laura, but I was also very fascinated to hear more about from Marta, because she was, because I know she's written a book about this, which I think is only in Italian so far. I'd love to read it when it's published in English. But Marta, you've been covering Turkey for quite a while, and there's a referendum happening in Turkey very soon. So you said, I think at the very end of your presentation, you said Turkey is now going beyond. What do you mean by that? Is there a point of no return for Turkey?
I told that Turkey is beyond censorship because there are no opposition media left. The point is this one. Before, I can't say that the Turkish press was free, but still you were able to find opposition's newspaper. And also, especially one newspaper called Cumhuriyet has a lot of troubles because half of his editorial staff is in jail or is under judicial inquiry. So the situation is very serious. And the point is on the other side that there are several pro-government, pro-Erdogan media who are really who are really writing the false, and it is a very interesting example of post-truth. In Italy, we called it post-verità, and there was a huge debate about that in the last weeks. And I think that, unfortunately, Turkey can be a very good example, and we will talk about that on Sunday morning with Ejetem Al-Quran, about how you can falsify the reality and give also to the audience a wrong message. For example, now, in Turkey, there are really very strong feelings against the European Union, against the West world in general, and I think that they are the result of the messages Erdogan gave to the civil society in the last 4 years. And it is a very good example to explain how public opinion can be orientated and distorted in a way by the political message. And you remember the referendum ahead. It will be a very important moment for Turkey. Unfortunately, now the situation seems quite tricky because no and yes are at the same percentage, with the 20% of people still undecided. But the climate inside the country is very, very, very dangerous. There is a very big there are very big rifts in the streets, so I think that the situation also for the internal stability of Turkey could get worse after the referendum.
Okay. Thank you, Marta. Now we're just going to hear from Rachel, so I'm going to pass the mic.
I just wanted to pick up on some of Marta's points about how nationalism is being used in lots of countries as a way of silencing the media and the public, basically, in raising any issues that governments don't like. I mean, one example that we've been working with a journalist called Zahina Rashid in the Maldives. I mean, for many people, the Maldives looks like a very beautiful holiday destination, but it's actually a very repressive country to work in as a journalist right now. I was just looking through the news yesterday to come up with some, examples of what was happening. The Maldives broadcasting regulator has slapped on a $64,000 fine on a TV station for covering a speech at an opposition rally. So the act of showing something that the government doesn't like, in effect, is being closed down. And they're using brand new defamation laws. And I think it's an example of both the thing that Marta was talking about, was how sort of nationalism can be framed as against journalists covering what's actually happening. And so it sort of frames journalists as somehow anti-patriotic for showing what's happening. And that's something that's happening in lots of countries, Hungary right now, Russia right now, as well as Turkey. But also the way that legislation like defamation legislation can be used as a tool to make journalists afraid of covering controversial stories. Like I was mentioning in the beginning, in Italy, the defamation laws are so scary that it's understandable, I think, that journalists would think, what am I putting on the line to cover this story? Because the effect is that I could lose my home, I could lose my job, I could, be massively in debt. I could obviously also be imprisoned. So, these things are connecting across the world, and the technology, the bots issue that Duncan was talking about, they're not going on in silos in one country and another country. They're actually happening in lots of different places, and authorities or state authorities in one country are watching what's happening. As we've seen with Trump, he's watched what's happening in, Ecuador with Correa, and some of the techniques he's using are directly parallel, and they've seen them be effective in closing down the media, and they've thought, we could try and use those.
Sure. From my side, I wish to add to the conversation here in the panel two topics, and one is a topic you mentioned somehow, self-censorship. We talk about censorship, but sometimes we as a journalist, we don't want to tell, what we do in case of self-censorship. Sometimes we self-censorshiping each other. So what about your experience? Rachel, of course, you have complete idea because you work with journalists, the focus of Index on Censorship also to check this trend, how works the self-censorship in the censorship system in general. But what about each one of us? Which kind of self-censorship sometimes we use when we feel, of course, that somebody can threaten us, or because you work as a foreign in another country, or because you have double nationality, or because your partner is a partner in the country where you work. There are a lot of issues, and I will just want to put this topic on panel.
I think that's really interesting because, of course, we were talking about the role of foreign correspondent versus local journalist. So sometimes there are things that you can say as an outsider in a country that the local journalist can't say. So I've had situations where journalists in East Africa, in Ethiopia, they're not going to go on record, they're not going to tell the story because they have to live in the country, and they are under threat. So, there's stuff that I can say that they can't say. But I think self-censorship is really interesting because you're right, because often we think of censorship as someone from the outside censoring us, but often what happens, and it's really interesting, Marta was talking about the example in Turkey, and I think just Rachel mentioned Trump, but it's kind of very similar, which is the ways in which the political tactic in which these countries and governments use, which is to try and close the space down and send cues to people. So they don't go to a newspaper and shut it down, but they change the law a little bit. They have a political reaction when there's a political situation in Kenya or Ethiopia or Turkey or wherever. And what happens is journalists get the signals that if they pursue certain stories, there could be consequences. So what happens is that people censor themselves and don't write what they should do, don't report what they should do, and don't cover the stories. The other thing I just want to come back, and I'll pass it back that way, in the conversation that I thought was really, really fascinating and interesting and important in social media, because I know, for example, in East Africa and across Africa, and I know this is the same elsewhere, that social media is really important, both as just a thing that people use in their everyday life, but also as journalists use it in terms of sources, getting stories, but also now people are being threatened with punishment threatened with being, sent to jail because they are sharing information online. Just to give a quick example, in East Africa and Kenya particularly, they've been using this law against journalists who share information on WhatsApp, who share information such as, when they've done a report on the ground and they've shared images or stories or numbers or anything. And the government in Kenya has been trying to use this law, which is misuse of a telecommunication gadget. I don't know if WhatsApp is a gadget, but that's how they describe it. So it's how social media and it's been policed. So maybe we could hear a couple of more comments, and then I think we should take some questions. Maybe Duncan.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on self-censorship. It's a big problem in Mexico as well. Whether for legal reasons, security reasons, or economic reasons, journalists do tend to hold back on certain stories or going into certain depth on these stories, and that just creates this cycle of impunity with the press is less effective, so they can't hold the government or criminals to account. And I think this even extends to activism. There's a certain self-censorship of activism because there's a history of repression. From the 1960s, there was a massacre of an entire square full of hundreds of student demonstrators. Just to a couple of years ago, there was a disappearance of 43 student teachers who were most likely massacred as well. And I think this leads to people being scared to go out on the streets and demonstrate because they can face arbitrary arrest, torture, and even disappearance. So I think that kind of stifles any kind of dissent in the country.
Okay. Thanks, Duncan. I think at this stage, because we have about 30 minutes left, we're just going to take some questions. So if you, I don't know if there's a mic. There is a mic at the back. I can see a lady with a mic at the back. So maybe if you just wait until a mic comes to you, just a question, and you could just say your name and where you're from would be really great. So I know it's early morning, but come on, don't be shy. Any questions? Anyone? There's two? Three. Okay. So let's take two at once and then we'll come.
Hi, I'm Ashley. I'm from the United States. And my question is, so I'm noticing a lot, especially in American media, that we're talking about fake news. And I know that your focus on censorship, generally as a journalist, is why am I not able to get the information that I need to share with the public? However, with the discussion of fake news, people are talking about how we're getting too much information. And some people are talking about perhaps censoring that information, maybe limiting the amount of fake news that enters the media. However, what I've noticed, at least in the States, is that people who read the fake news, they truly believe it. It validates their feelings, and they would feel like that is a form of strong censorship. So I want to know what your opinion is on maybe the other side. How could that potentially affect journalists who are trying to get information that's missing, and sort of an eye for an eye retaliation?
Okay, thank you. If you just pass the mic to Anatella, to the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Antonella Sinopoli. I'm editor-in-chief of Voci Globali. My question is for Laura about Yemen and about social media. I would like to know more about social media, if these means of communication are allowed in the country and or they have been shut down.
Okay, we'll take one more question and I'll pass this back to the panelists. There's another hand up somewhere. Was there a third person? No? Okay, so maybe I'll just go straight to Laura and directly answer that question about Yemen and social media.
Yeah, as I said before, the media landscape in Yemen is completely changed, and the war changed the media landscape in 2 years, and this happened also on social media. First of all, you need to know that the social media users in Yemen are too many. Not on Twitter, but basically mostly on Facebook. Even people who are not educated, they are not able to read or to read Arabic, standard Arabic, or to write it. They use Facebook. And so I think of Facebook people here would be very happy to know that. But the point is that this is in the polarization actually in the country among citizens and among all the factions in the war. Means that people, they continue to spread what happened in their villages, for example, plus some kind of polarization, fake news, and trying to polarize themselves and put themselves in a part of the country in war instead of another one. That's how citizens use social media in Yemen. But most interesting is how, of course, media they use it. And actually, you can say that, as I said before, we're shut down a lot of websites, so plus social media, the presence of them in social media platforms and Twitter accounts. I can say that those happened before. It's always happened in Yemen, because during the time of the previous president, Saleh, a lot of media belonging to Houthis or to people who wanted to separate the country in the southern Yemen, the northern Yemen, they received threats and they couldn't, use social media. Now everything is mixed up much more than before. Can say that 80% of the independent media are shut down, and the only media that are working also on social media are the media who are reporting from outside, using reporters on the ground, but they are absolutely unknown. And so actually, it's a very, very difficult situation. We have some people who are very, they have a lot of followers, and actually they are considered voices into part of the country. Like we have Bafana, who is a very, very well-known influencer on Twitter, tweeting from the north of the country, but he is based in the north of the country, and he's with Houthis and with Saleh, so no one is shutting down his Twitter. But of course, if it was, for example, some of the Islahi, which is the Muslim Brotherhood of the North, will be shut down for sure.
Okay, I just want to come to Rachel, because I think this is really timely, because I know, has Index just done something about about fake news? So I just come back to the question from the lady in the US.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good question. In fact, I think it's almost a session unto itself. So perhaps you could persuade the festival to put it on. I think it's really, I think fake news, the term, has almost become nonsense because it means so little now, in a sense. And I know it's been it's almost like a trigger word at this conference. Everyone has to talk about it. I think we really have to drill down into what it actually means. It's being used in so many different ways, and it actually means different things to different people. So are we talking about the way people are using it as a term to say, I don't like what you're saying, I disagree with you, you can shut up, which is a way that it's become used. So, in a sense, President Trump is using it like that. So, you're fake news, as in, the BBC or the New York Times, I don't like you. I mean, but I've seen now people using it like that on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, saying, you're fake news. And what it really means is, I don't like what you're saying, I disagree with you. And then there's obviously been these factories of people who are sort of creating false stories, made-up stories. It's tied together with the way that some governments have been using the social media machine to create a propaganda machine, in a sense, that puts out stories that they would like to see covered. But I think it's we have to resist the idea that I think that social media platforms have some sort of censoring responsibility. Do we actually want to see a world where we're giving the power to organizations like Google and saying, right, you should take down this story, you should take down that story? Because where does that stop? If that is actually a really frightening scenario, because, those people who are saying, well, I would rather that story wasn't covered, wait till the day when their story is taken down because somebody else doesn't like it. So, we have to have a much more thoughtful approach to this, I think. And often what one person is calling fake news is something that they just disagree with. So I think we really have to think about where machines are creating falsehoods and propaganda, and how we come back against that, and where things are just stories that we disagree with. And I think we have to be much more thoughtful in the world of journalism about our responses to that. But I also think there's a responsibility on the public to be more thoughtful and interrogative about what they read and what they consume, because you know, as a citizen, you have a responsibility to yourself to be thinking, do I believe this? Does this feel real? Does this actually make sense that, you know, this dog has landed on the moon? Whatever, you know, and check out a bit more beyond the first line of something on Facebook, because there's some really scary research out of Stanford University recently, which was basically saying that a lot of students, and the US students in this case, couldn't tell the difference between something that was like an advertising feature and something that was a story coming out of a respected media organization. And it followed up and said that partly was because they were just reading the headline. They weren't even clicking through to the link. So, you know, we all have a responsibility as individuals to be a bit more questioning and thoughtful as in the way that we consume information, I think.
Okay, thanks. I think we've got about another 20 minutes, so I'll come back to Duncan and Marta, but maybe just take a couple more questions.
Hi, I'm Eliana. I'm a journalism student from the Netherlands. I was wondering, how do you manage to stay safe in a country like Yemen or Mexico or the countries you work in?
Okay, one other question. No? Okay, so we just go to Marta. How do you stay safe when you work in Turkey?
First of all, we do not feel safe at all. Also because now we start, this is an important question because now we are starting to have problems not only with the authorities, but several times also with people in the street. There were several cases reported of colleagues who have been insulted or even attacked in the street while they were doing their reports. So it is something very worrying, because if you have to take care of you with the authorities, okay, you can in a way try to be cautious or to try to avoid their attention. But for example, when I'm in Turkey, I'm very careful when I use my smartphone. Even if, even in that field, things are becoming more and more difficult, because before maybe we generally use VPN solutions in order to make the authorities don't understand where we were. But now they have blocked almost of these websites. So and programs, so it's becoming trickier. But if you have to deal with 80 million people, of course, it is more difficult. And it is the result of the nationalism Rachel was mentioning before. Actually, Turkey has ever had a problem with its national identity. I mean, Turkish people is strongly nationalist by nature. But now Erdogan is creating, I would like to say, another kind of national identity made of an ethnic identity, of course, but also a religious one. I mean, the Sunni Islam one. In fact, one of the minorities who are risking more now in Turkey are the Alevis, the Alevi. And it is something, it will emerge, especially if Erdogan wins the referendum, because then he will try to impose the same identity for everyone. But what I can say as a foreign correspondent is that doing our job is becoming more and more difficult, also because people do not want to speak at all. It is very difficult to get an interview. Sometimes they ask not to report their name in the articles. And for example, immediately after the coup, I was in Istanbul. One day I called an intellectual who didn't know by person, and he asked to my office, to my newspaper, to write an email to confirm that I was working for that newspaper. just to make you understood how people is suspicious now, and also, okay, and also they have fear about the situation. So it is difficult to do our job, but it is difficult to stay safe because, at least in Turkey, what can happen to you now is totally unpredictable, and also we were not used to that. First, people were very conservative, were maybe not very talkative, but they weren't angry. Now they became very angry with foreigners in general, and with foreign journalists in particular.
All right, thank you, Marta. I just wanted to ask Duncan about how social media is being used by the government in Mexico. If you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's not been proven, but there's a lot of bots and trolls who many investigators are pretty certain that they're being used by the government, sometimes possibly through publicity firms that the government contracts. And these bots will, for example, if there's a trending topic on Twitter which is critical of the government in some way, they can use Twitter's algorithms against this trending topic by sending out spam. So they could send out violent images or pornographic images with the same hashtag, and then Twitter's algorithms will then pick that up as spam, and they'll get rid of the trending topic. So one way that activists have responded to this, for example, is they'll start the hashtag with a 1 at the end, and then as soon as it goes down, they'll start it again with a 2 and then a 3. And in the case of the disappeared student teachers, I think it got up to about 20-something before it kind of finally faded away, but it just kept going down, this hashtag. And also in terms of intimidation, there's been so many cases recently where particularly female journalists are getting horrific death threats, rape threats, from trolls who seem to be linked to the government as well. They seem to specifically go after dissidents or people who are speaking out against things, and they don't conform to how you might normally expect just some random troll to act. They do seem to have specific political motivations in terms of who they're attacking.
Okay, thanks. So we can see that example from Mexico, how that trolling is becoming perhaps an instrument of the state to again silence and censor journalists doing their work. I wanted to ask Laura about the topic of laws and terrorism, because I know from my work in East Africa that's a really important thing, where the state is using terror laws on the law books as a means, as a way to stifle journalists. I wanted to just ask you about the example from Yemen and maybe your work in Iraq, if you can talk about that.
Yeah, and I'd like also to hear more about Horn of Africa by you on the same topic. Yeah, this is one of the tricky things in doing journalism in certain countries. We should know very well the laws, and one of the laws that cause more fear in journalists and self-censorship is the law on terrorism. One, for example, in Iraq, which is the country I know most with Yemen, because I reported from there when Iraq wasn't sexy for media after the American exit strategy. So basically, no news from Iraq for 6 years at all, and now became again sexy just because of ISIS. I just want to underline this because it's one of my favorite polemic topics. Anyway, and the law on terrorism is very clear and present in Iraq, very clear and present in Yemen, a lot of Middle Eastern countries, and it's applied when every citizen and all press is talking about the politicians. People who are in the government, and they say, for example, the Ministry of Economy, like happened in 2006 in Iraq, is a thief, or you have evidences of that, you will be in jail for terrorism, because it's something against the state, where the state is identified with the establishment, which is absolutely crazy, because it's against basically our goal, which is also investigate to try to let the society growing around good values. So the point is the local journalists are always this way, and when they try to say something, and they also have the evidence of that, if they publish the news, they were in jail or sometimes they're kidnapped or they are tortured. This was happening in Iraq for years. Mm-hmm. Now we talk about ISIS, but what happened in 6 years? I met colleagues and training colleagues for hostile environment that told me that just because they said that the mayor of the city was a thief or he was violent, he has his group of people defend them with guns, he was kidnapped, he was hanged on the roof, he was tortured very bad for 2 days with the promise of never write again about it. And that's the Iraq from where comes ISIS. And where we were when all this happened, and still happening. So one of the questions here is how governments, they use these laws to defend their corrupted establishment.
Yeah, and I think you see that example, Laura, just to pick up, in East Africa, in Kenya particularly, and Ethiopia, where the governments, again, are using terror laws to try and silence journalists. So there's a group, just a quick example, from Ethiopia called Zonine Bloggers, and they started as a collective online on Facebook because that was the only way to get information out in Ethiopia. There was no other way. These activists, some of them became journalists, some of them are now in exile, but they were all taken and arrested and held for quite a while. Some were released in 2015, just after a visit by President Obama to Ethiopia. But the state there charged them under terror laws, and that is a really useful instrument because what it does is the same thing in Turkey and in Mexico and other parts of the world where there are issues of censorship, is that it's the way in which journalists and news organizations get framed. So whether it's from the drug angle, whether it's from, whether it's from the terrorism angle, we see that happening across the world. So I think we're almost done, but I just wanted to maybe give the audience one last chance. We could take maybe 1-2 brief questions. So if there are any more, so last chance, so don't be shy. Does anybody have any final questions?
Just us.
Just us, okay. So I'm just going to give all of us a minute maybe, just to summarize. So if we just go down, so maybe start from Duncan, if you have anything, just a minute, and then we should be done.
Sure. Well, I guess the main thing is the complete lack of justice and protection when it comes to these threats against journalists. I think that the threats and the attacks are likely to continue for the immediate future. I don't see how that's going to change, but what Mexico really needs is this greater sense of solidarity for journalists to come together and organize and defend themselves. And I think they need more support from society in general, and particularly anyone related to the media. Like I mentioned, the newspaper owners often don't do much to protect their own staff. The businesses that sponsor them don't really play any role in the protection of journalists. The government does pretty much nothing to protect journalists. So I think there needs to be a lot more organisation across civil society and the government to make a much greater effort to defend journalists from these problems.
Thank you. Regarding Turkey, what I can say is that Turkey, till 5 years ago, was supposed to be a country joining the European Union not in the short time, of course, but it was a long way, but Turkey was supposed to become a full member of the European Union. Now there is a Turkish-German journalist, Deniz Yücel, in jail, of course, on the charge of being a member of a terrorist organization, and the European Union is not doing anything. There is a silence from the European Union and political authorities in the name of the single national interest, which is something appalling. So I really think, and also there is a deal on refugees, a shameful deal on refugees signed between the European Union and Turkey, and this is why I think the European Union doesn't want to deal with the Turkish issue. The point is that if Erdogan wins the referendum, everything will get worse. The condition of journalists inside the country, the condition of people inside the country, and the relations between the European Union and Turkey. So I think that Europe thought if Turkey stays out from the European Union, we have a problem less. No, we have a problem more. And unfortunately, the solution is becoming trickier and trickier. And so I really hope that at least after the referendum, when everything will get worse, the European Union will start to give concrete signals, because so far it is really something. And this is why, as a foreign correspondent, I do not feel safe when I'm in Turkey, because I know that behind me, there is nothing.
Thank you.
Well, I think that we never need to stop advocacy campaigns to defend journalists or try to save them from any kind of threats and risks, and especially about journalists who work in environments like in countries that are under shadow, like Maldives, as Rachel said before. I just want to say Bahrain. And I'm always asking myself why, for example, we don't do advocacy campaigns for journalists in general, local journalists who work in certain countries. Like why for 6 years we knew about the situation of Iraqi journalists in general, all journalists, and we never did a massive advocacy campaign for them all. Why? And so I can say that also these topics, we have kind of double standards, and we should think about it. The other point I wish to underline is we should be very, very careful about what's happening in Europe. We are in Europe, for example, we are in Italy now, and we didn't talk about it, but I want just to put this here. Journalists, basically, sometimes they are losing the contact with the audience, with the real audience, just because you know the establishment makes a lot of pressure on the editor-in-chief, and sometimes you publish something and arrives the call. We know how it works. But actually, the audience is taking distance from journalists. We know, for example, this in Italy with the campaign of Movement 5 Stars. And what does the Movement 5 Stars? It says all journalists, they lie. And journalists, they are not doing a good job. And the second point they say is when journalists start to investigate about them, for example, then arrives calls, but kind of threats a little bit. So the environment is changing, and it's changing in bad. And if something will happen also in the issues of migration and so on, we just need to be very careful. And I think that the only solution is really work well. Even though our editor-in-chief, they say, for example, we are not interested in this topic. Continue to investigate and do your job and stay close to your audience and try to understand what the people want to know by what's happening on the ground.
Just quickly, because I know we have very little time left, I want to make the point that journalists need to make the argument to the public about why journalism is important. Because if the public don't value journalism, then the relationship, the understanding of why they should care about journalists being attacked or things like defamation laws is not there. I think that's a really big challenge for journalists. So it needs to be done more. It needs to be, the public needs to value it. And I was just going to say that I have 2 copies of our latest report on mapping media freedom with me. So if anybody is interested in those, come and see me afterwards.
Yeah, just to say thank you so much for coming this morning. I know it's very early, but we've heard from myself from East Africa covering issues of censorship and freedom of expression. We heard from Rachel from the work that Index on Censorship is doing, from Laura, who's in Yemen, but who's reported extensively across the Middle East, from Marta, from Turkey, from Duncan, from Mexico. So just thank you for attending. If you're interested, check information about Index online and follow our work, and hopefully we'll see you here again next year. Thank you. Sorry. Good job, yes.
Fields. Ismail Inashi is a freelance journalist based in London, and he usually covers migration issues. He was in Italy in the south, and he reports about mafia in the south, and is also a fellow of Dar Center. And Duncan Tucker is a British freelance based in Mexico. So he currently used to deal with what's moving there: human rights issues, migration, drugs, Mexican politics. And Marta Ottaviani, as I said before, she's a correspondent from Turkey. She lived there for 8 years, and I can say is the Italian journalist who knows, I think, better than others the country. And just 2 words about me. I'm also contributing to Index on Censorship, and I used to cover issues from the Gulf, especially from Yemen and Iraq, where the 2 countries I cover mostly. So, Rachel, just want to start with you, of course, and can you give to the audience an insight about the activities that Index does since years, and what's the mood of censorship in the world right now? And especially focusing on Americas and Europe, because something's changing. We feel that in the global trend, something's changing. And
journalist access. So in Poland, in December, the government tried to restrict the number of journalists, for instance, going in to cover Parliament. We've also seen measures of the government favouring the pro-government media, and how the pressures on the independent media increasing, which is a parallel story in Hungary. But I think it's important to remember that there is issues, different types of censorship operating in every country, and not to ignore the issues that are going on in your own country. So issues like massive defamation actions in Italy, for instance, where Italian journalists are threatened with massive fines and prison sentences potentially for covering controversial stories. So, so I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Rachel. And I think we will be back to some focus on Europe and on Italy, because we are here, so we can talk about it. And Ismail, you currently report about refugee crisis. You were in Sicily. You are originally from Corn of Africa for family reasons. So this is an area with a massive problem about censorship, governments, dictatorships, and plus urgent social issues like terrorism or, for example, malnutrition or anything related to human rights issues. So what's your experience in these fields?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I report for Index on Censorship, like a few people on the table, covering East Africa largely, looking at issues of censorship, threats to journalists. And I've reported on two of the countries which are perhaps the most censored. In fact, they're in the top 10 most censored countries in the world, and that is Eritrea and Ethiopia. And Eritrea often makes the top of the, or the bottom of the list as the country with the least free press. So I've been covering issues around threats to journalists, so there's physical threats, intimidations, police, usage of laws, particularly terrorism laws you've seen. And I'm just noticing that Rachel has a copy. If you don't mind, I grab. So this was an issue that Index did, Danger in Truth, Truth in Danger, special report, journalist under fire and under pressure. And I did a report for this issue, which was looking at threats to journalists in Kenya. And I reported about a Kenyan journalist called Yasin Juma, who reports on Al-Shabaab, the terror group in Somalia, and was looking at the war that Kenya and the Kenyan security forces.
Good morning, welcome everybody. Thanks to be here so early and waking up early to listen to our panel, Word on Censorship panel. As you guess, is something about censorship, of course, something with journalists we deal, we can say daily somehow, and not only journalists, also citizens of the world. Well, why we choose this topic? Here we have Index on Censorship editor and a lot of people, they are contributors of Index on Censorship magazine, plus Marta Ottaviani, she's really a journalist very committed in the issue of censorship in Turkey. So all these people here, I think they know what we are talking about. And why choosing this topic? Because we can say the new winds of censorship are blowing not only from the Middle East and Africa, but also from the Americas and Europe. And that's what we want to talk about today. So I briefly introduce our speakers one by one. Rachel Jolie, as I said before, is the editor of Index on Censorship magazine, and she has 20 years of experience and is emerging this change.
Yes, so hello, as Laura said, my name's Rachel Jolie. I'm the editor of Index on Censorship magazine, which looks like this. We're a quarterly magazine that covers the world and is read around the world on issues of freedom of expression and censorship. We have reporters around the world, so it's a mixture of journalism and fiction of novelists, playwrights who are censored in their own country. And we also have a project called Mapping Media Freedom, which this is the latest report, which covers 42 countries around Europe. So we're looking at attacks on the media in all those countries. And anyone can register an attack, so it's crowdsourced. And then the report is fact-checked by our team before it's published and mapped. And we have obviously seen an increase in attacks on journalists, which include physical threats, threats about losing their jobs, and people losing their jobs and being imprisoned, particularly, as you'll all be aware, I hope, from Turkey this year. There's been a massive increase. But we're also very worried about what's been happening in Hungary and Poland, where the government has been using its powers to restrict